Our first speaker this afternoon is Louis Kaplan. He teaches history and theory of photography and new media at the University of Toronto, where he also serves as the inaugural chair of the Department of Visual Studies. He's widely recognized for his innovative work on spirit photography, which he will be presenting this afternoon, photographic humor, the new vision, and various kinds of photography theory. He's the author of 8 books, including American Exposures, Photography and Community in the 20th Century, and his 2008 title, The Strange Case of William Mumler, Spirit Photographer. In fact, Mumler, the trailblazing photographer of ghosts, will be the subject of his talk this afternoon, titled Of Spooks, Proofs, and Truths, Reflections on the Mumler Spirit Photograph Case. Let's please welcome Louis Kaplan.
Great. Okay, thank you, Mia, for those kind words and for the invitation to share an old New York photographic ghost story with you today. And it's also great to see 6 Mumler images in the marvelous exhibition upstairs. In the part of the exhibition entitled Novelties and Amusements. And I want in my presentation this afternoon to move the Mumler story into other frames of reference as well. So shall we begin? Let's go with the bopper there. In April of 1869, William H. Mumler appeared before Justice John Dowling in the Court of Special Sessions at the Tombs Police Court here in New York for a preliminary hearing on an unusual charge. Mumler was accused of fraud and larceny for making and selling photographs at his studio on 630 Broadway that purported to bring back the spirits of the dead on glass plate negatives. The birth of spirit photography in the U.S. in the 1860s offers one of the most fascinating and haunting chapters in the history of the medium, and the strange case of William Mumler raises a number of key questions about the evidentiary, documentary, and truth-telling functions of the photograph. This Boston-based engraver turned photographer claimed that he was capable of conjuring the spirits of the dead in his images. In capturing the ghosts of the dearly departed for friends and relatives, Mumler also touched a powerful psychological nerve in a mass public coping with mourning and bereavement in an era of high infant mortality rates and, of course, against the backdrop of the Civil War. In Mumler's most famous spirit photograph, taken in 1872, the ghost of the assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln, appears to give comfort to his wife and the longtime avid spiritualist, Mary Todd Lincoln. And I ask you to notice the pose of Lincoln behind Mary Todd with his hands placed around her, touching her, and linking up with many other images. You'll see that typical Mumler pose and bringing out the touching aspects of these photographs, the haptic qualities as well. With the rise of the popular religious movement of spiritualism, many people believed that communication with the dead was now possible, and that spirit photography was a new phase in spirit communication and communion. While the so-called spiritual telegraphy summoned by the Fox sisters consisted of oral rappings and tappings, spiritual photography, as some proponents like to call it, promised visible evidence of the existence of the afterlife. While believers held that Mumler's activities were supernatural phenomena that provided visual proofs of the truths of spiritualism, doubting skeptics who did not share this worldview challenged these images as fraudulent tricks of double exposure and a swindle perpetrated upon a gullible public. The photographic phenomena of Mumler and the controversy surrounding him reached its climax in a dramatic trial after Mumler was arrested through a sting operation set up by the mayor's office. Now, this highly publicized case put the religious movement of spiritualism and its belief in communication with the dead itself on trial. Mumler's fascinating trial raised questions about the status and meaning of the photograph as evidence in a court of law and its claim to function as a reliable and accurate document in general. This presentation will review the legal arguments offered by the prosecution and defense about Mumler's contested photos, whether deemed to be darkroom tricks and manipulations or spiritual proofs and images made by divine intervention. While both skeptics and believers at the trial invested in the evidentiary quality of the photograph, they made drastically different assumptions about what it was that spirit photographs provided proofs of. Here I draw upon Jennifer Mnookin's insightful essay, The Image of Truth, Photographic Evidence and the Power of Analogy. While believers saw an image such as this one as supernatural realism, providing, we might say, physical traces of a heavenly referent, skeptics saw Mumler's images as examples of mechanical illusionism, providing evidence of nothing more than photographic manipulation, and therefore documenting nothing but lies and falsehoods. With testimony from such notables as the impresario P.T. Barnum for the prosecution, who claimed that he knew a humbug and a hoax when he saw one, but also the banker Charles Livermore for the defense, who was convinced that Mumler had conjured the ghost of his deceased wife in a number of photographs. This sensational case received extensive coverage in the popular press for 3 weeks, with testimony published verbatim on a daily basis. And there were even witty caricatures published as well. And here you see this gentleman, Mr. Dobbs, at the request of his affianced, sits for his photograph. Unconsciously, he happens in at Mumler's studio, and the result, portrait of Dobbs with his 5 deceased wives in spirituo. So you see, it was a flashpoint at the time. In the strange case at hand, the recording device was the analogical camera. And the key issue was the nature, or was it the supernature, of the evidence that it provided when it produced images that claimed to be spirit photos. Writing in 1859, or just 3 years before the appearance of Mumler's first photos, essays by both Charles Baudelaire and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. privileged photography's documentary, archival, and record-keeping functions. Now, I would argue that these aspects of the photographic medium in particular bind it to legal discourse specifically, so that both photographic and legal regimes share in the rhetoric of facticity, proof, and evidence. This helps to explain the wonder and astonishment with which Mumler's photos were greeted, for they repositioned a recording device and a medium associated with truth and factual evidence to one connected with spiritualism. It is interesting to note in this context that Mumler's memoir and apologia, published a few years after the trial, rebuts his accusers by invoking a spiritualist version of the truth and the evidentiary. In the following proclamation, Mumler plays the role of the innocent and persecuted martyr, asserting the truth claims of both his supernatural photographic practice and his notorious legal proceedings. We can read it together. It begins, "In these days of earnest inquiry for spiritual truths, I feel that it is incumbent upon me to contribute what evidences of a future existence I may have obtained in my 14 years' experience in spirit photography. Nevertheless, it has been a difficult task to battle with the skeptical world, to bear persecution and poverty, to outlive slander, and to overcome the many obstacles that beset the path of one whose mission it is to advance some new truth." End of quote. Thus, Mumler's trial pitted this new truth against prosecutor Elbridge T. Gerry's charge that he was nothing but a hoaxer, liar, swindler. Gary's final argument in the Mumler Spirit Photograph Case enables us to review the rhetorical strategies as well as legal arguments and precedents deployed by the prosecution to construct its case. Let's recall that Mumler was accused of 2 counts of felony, fraud, and 1 count of misdemeanor, larceny. In the first 2 instances, Gary indicted Mumler as a swindler and a cheat at common law, who, quote, by false pretenses defrauded and cheated the marshal, Joseph H. Tooker, out of and obtained from him the sum of $10, lawful money of the United States of America. I'm reading this very highly rhetorical text from Jerry's final argument. Now, it's been noted that Mumler charged an exorbitant sum for a dozen photographs, in those days $10, and this was further proof for some that he was only in it for the money. This point further indicates that there was a strong class bias in terms of Mumler's clientele, meaning that only a select and exclusive group of celebrities, politicians, and affluent patrons, spiritualist or not, could afford a visit to his studio. And here you see the abolitionist leader, William Lloyd Garrison, sitting for a portrait, and lo and behold, the senator, ghost of Charles Sumner, appears behind him. In the final instance, Gary accused him of practicing a larceny of the money by trick and device, because he had taken money in advance and retained it without giving Tooker what he had paid to obtain. In other words, Mumler did not deliver the goods that he had promised to Tooker, quote, a photograph of a spirit by supernatural means. Keeping things real and in the realm of facts, Gary stated that the claim that these pictures are of supernatural agency is scarcely capable of proof, because the law, quote, never attributes to unusual cases results which may be accounted for by the employment of ordinary means to produce them. Given this last point, it becomes clear why Gary turned to photographic experts like Abraham Bogardus of the National Photographic Association, Charles Hull, and Oscar Mason, both of the photographic section of the American Institute, as his star witnesses. Their testimony provided the prosecutor with what he needed to argue that these photos documented darkroom tricks of the trade rather than images produced by supernatural means. And at the trial, talking about issues of evidence, both Bogardus and the Rockwood Gallery provided the prosecution with many samples of their own spirit photographic manipulations, and indeed, there were 20 images that were submitted as evidence. This one was reproduced in Harper's by the Rockwood Gallery, and if you notice here, that's P.V. Hickey. He was the science writer from the New York World who helped to bring the case into the limelight, and he's somehow sitting here, and lo and behold, the ghost of Joseph Tooker, the marshal, appears behind him. So you could see that the studios, the prosecution was having a lot of fun with making their own mock-ups of Mumler photographs. And also, this one's even more interesting, in an uncanny foreshadowing of Mumler's most famous photograph that was taken 3 years later, Bogardus teamed up with P.T. Barnum to produce a self-conscious faking it image that features the spirit head of Abe Lincoln hovering over the showman. Maybe that's where Mumler was getting his great ideas. Gary also made it a point to undermine the witnesses for the defense who proclaimed that their Mumler images were genuine by arguing that such authentication by spiritualist clients that these were spirit photos of their deceased relatives could only be a self-fulfilling prophecy, whether on account of their peculiar system of belief or their being in a state of mourning. Here you see John L. Glover with his mother, who obviously he's grieving at the time. Making a fine distinction between the evidence of truth and the evidence of a belief in a supernatural agency, the prosecutor summarized this line of reasoning as follows. Those who went prepared to believe, of course, did believe on very slight proof. And that is all this evidence of the defense proves. And notice this distinction. It proves the existence of a belief in the prisoner's statement, not the truth of those statements. There is no positive proof whatsoever of any supernatural agency, only evidence that certain persons believe, with his emphasis, that it exists, end of quote. Nevertheless, Gary would not settle for any type of religious pluralism, nor allow the spiritualists the space to hold their beliefs peaceably. Instead, he took to the offensive at numerous points in the trial, with the express purpose of branding spiritualism as a product of religious heresy and expressly at odds with Christian doctrines. And he even went further to psychopathologize spiritualists, asserting that they suffered from hallucinations and mental delusions in their beliefs regarding spiritual manifestations, like in this one where Fanny Conant, who was a medium herself, went for a sitting, and all of a sudden these spirit hands, the divine intervention, the hands of God, showering her with flowers. So all that Gary could say in response to an image like this was, quote, "These were the phantasma of daydreams, the rooted fancy of a mind diseased," end of quote. On the other side of the courtroom, John D. Townsend led Mumler's defense team, and he offered, if I might say, a spirited closing argument that addressed both legal and technological aspects of the case. Proclaiming Mumler's innocence, that there was, quote, nothing that would justify the court in committing the prisoner to answer to a charge of fraud before the grand jury, Townsend argued that Mumler had been charged with fraud not because of any wrongdoing he had committed, but only because the prosecution could not understand how he had produced the spirits appearing in his photos, and because Marshall Tooker could not recognize the particular spirit that appeared on the photographic plate. In light of this last point, Townsend argued that the most egregious thing for which Mumler could be charged was a breach of contract, because he promised that if a form did appear during the photo shoot, then it would be, quote, that of the spirit nearest in sympathy with him at the time, end of quote. Now, to get to this image and why I've put up Samuel F.B. Morse. In explaining away the gap between Mumler's promise and the actual apparition that appeared, Townsend took the opportunity to make a fascinating analogy between Mumler's spirit photography and Samuel F.B. Morse's invention of the telegraph 25 years prior. This ingenious gesture echoes the opening of Mumler's memoir, when, as you recall, he positioned himself as the struggling pioneer and prophet of a new technology called spirit photography, still ironing out the kinks to make it fully operational. Townsend, therefore, viewed the present case as one about a partially failed transmission of getting the wrong ghost on the line and then documented in the frame, instead of a case of intentional fraud. Here's Townsend's explanation. It's a long quote. Let's read it together. Suppose, when Morse was struggling to put before the world the great fact that by means of electricity, communication might be had on the instant between persons hundreds of miles apart, some skeptic should have asked to have a message sent from New York to Boston, that Mr. Morse, confident of the truth of his discovery, should attempt to send the message, but that, owing to some cause not clearly known to him, the continuity should be broken, and the attempt to transmit the message should fail. Would such failure be counted a fraud by any court or jury in Christendom? And yet, Mumler is charged with fraud because the spirit figure which appeared on Tooker's photographs is not recognized by Tooker as being the representation of any person known to him. End of quote. Clearly, Townsend understood that he had to defend spiritualism as much as Mumler's good name at the trial, because the question, quote, as to what is the belief of spiritualists had been introduced into this examination, end of quote. As I discussed previously, Gary slandered spiritualism as a religion of insanity and delusion. To counteract such charges, Townsend framed spiritualism as a respectable option for popular 19th century religious belief, citing one report, credible or not, that claimed that there were 11 million adherents to or with an interest in spiritualism in the US at the time. Townsend dared Gary to charge 1/3 of the American population with insanity. Townsend also resorted to quoting scriptural passages that could be interpreted in ways that would give a sound spiritual basis to Mumler's practice and the witnessing of spirits in photos. Despite Gary's objections, Townsend shifted the argument from photographic to theological proofs. As a wondrous example of a biblical case study, he cited the Witch of Endor as a conjurer of spirits, whose powers could have been captured quite easily if only there had been cameras back in that day. Quote, spiritualists found their belief on the Bible. Throughout the book, we find mention of spirits. The Witch of Endor raised the spirit of Samuel. And if we believe in the Bible, counsel could not see how we can fail to believe that spirits do appear at times and are palpable to the sight of those mortals gifted with the power of seeing them, end of quote. This is exactly the type of rhetorical question that Townsend put to both Bogardus and Barnum. He asked in the trial, now, if photography were known in those days, would it have been impossible to photograph the spirit or the ghost of Samuel, end of quote? What better way for Townsend to dispel the charges of fraud, prank, or humbug cast upon his client than to align him with the Holy Bible, or the very book upon which he had given his oath when testifying to the veracity of the ghosts unleashed by his uncanny photographic practice. Ironically, it was another ingenious maneuver by Townsend that carried the day in court for his client. For who really was to say in the end that Mumler's photographs were evidence of anything if the prosecution could not locate the exact cause of the manipulation, such as in an image like this one, which is in the show? Townsend was able to challenge the meaning attributed by the prosecution for the 20 images that it submitted as evidence and as proof of Mumler's fraud. As Professor Mnookin has written, Townsend's anti-evidentialist position rested on the idea that, quote, the photographs themselves could not provide definitive evidence about their mode of manufacture. For this, it was necessary to look not at the product, right, this image, but at the process of how he did it. This in turn meant that for all the 9 purported methods of deceit that were enumerated in the proceedings, the prosecution still was not able to figure out how Mumler actually did the trick, and therefore it had no case in the end. Judge Dowling had to admit that despite his moral qualms, quote, the prosecution have failed to make out their complaint, end of quote, and therefore Mumler was acquitted of all charges. Now, final part, bringing into today. In our digital photographic era, the strange case of William Mumler resonates with us for another important reason. In a computer world where the digital montage aesthetic of Photoshop has become our second nature, and where photography has receded from the indexical and the evidentiary in a rapprochement with the painterly icon, and therefore with the realms of fantasy and the imagination, we are haunted by the ghosts of William Mumler because his spirit photographic practice serves as an early analogical precursor. In other words, spirit photography always already offers us an early instance of the risks posed by photomontage and the demise of the evidentiary model of photographic truth. Concurring with an overarching theme of the faking it exhibition, let me conclude with a review of how this risk was already present in analog photography, and that one of the first crises of the photograph as an authentic and trustworthy document of record can be traced to Mumler's spirit photographs. For while Mumler's acquittal vindicated those who believed that his images were supernatural, the trial also led to a more skeptical viewing of the veracity of photos in general, with the public becoming more attuned to the ways in which photographs could be faked. This was something that was picked up very lucidly in an editorial published in the New York World on May the 4th, 1869, at the conclusion of the trial that this newspaper did so much to instigate. The editorial comments, as you shall see, specifically focus not so much on Mumler, whom it considered to be an untrustworthy charlatan and con man, but rather on the trusted testimony of someone they deemed to be a professional, Abraham Bogardus. One finds here the submission of evidence regarding various types of photographic manipulation that put the evidentiary model into question. It's a lengthy quote, but it bears repeating because it counters Mumler's new truth of spirit photography with the monstrous and fearful possibilities, as it says, of montage practice. We know from Gary's review of the photographs submitted as evidence at the trial that this image, picture of a lady with her hand in a gentleman's hair, refers to Mumler's image of the deceased wife of Charles Livermore. And here's the quote, or the first part of the quote. One portion of the evidence in the great spirit photography case reveals some fearful possibilities. It is deposed by a witness, a professional photographer, Bogardus, that he could, quote, take a man with an angel over his head, or with a pair of hands on his head. And also that the picture of a lady that was shown him with her hand in a gentleman's hair might with equal case have been taken to represent this complacent feminine with her arm around the sitter. In fact, says the witness, the process of taking them, these miraculous pictures, can be changed to any extent almost, end of quote. This being so, what a vista does the fact reveal, exclamation point. Who henceforth can trust the accuracy of a photograph? Heretofore, we have been led to believe that nature, the whole of nature, and nothing but nature could be took. Okay, now, I want to pause here to comment how the editorial poses a double-barreled question around the meaning of picture taking in the age of double exposure, of being doubly exposed. The first take seems to resolve what has been taken in these pictures as the writer seeks to demystify miraculous pictures as unnatural manipulations. But meanwhile, the second meaning of the took, the second part of the word taken, being taken, raises the question, of course, of ethics and deceit, or who is actually being taken if one can no longer trust the accuracy of a photograph or photographic truth claims. The editorial then moves on to a discussion of the implications of photographic manipulation that go well beyond the matter of ghosts in photographs. Here is a prophetic statement about libels, slanders, and lawsuits to come in a litigious culture of photographic celebrity that thrives on the voyeuristic sensations of tabloid journalism and infotainment. One only needs to substitute the slandering of the lieges, as the quote you'll see says, of 1869, with the TV and movie stars and politicians of today. And we can talk about this particular image a little bit later in the campaign of 2007. What ravages will this possibility make of private reputation? And what confusion entail on the historian of future times? Photographs have been treasured in a belief that, like figures, they could not lie. But here is a revelation that they may be made to lie with a most deceiving exactness. Evidently, the lawyers will have to furbish up their weapons in false pretenses if this kind of thing is to come in vogue, and see to it also that we have special statutes against photographic slander, in representing the lieges in places where they never were, attitudes they never assumed, and companionships they abhor, as the real, old, original inventor of this process does holy water. End of quote. the anonymous editor cannot resist in his conclusion to mark the diabolic aspect that clings to these darkroom manipulations, such that their corruption of photographic innocence brings this normally ethical medium into contact with sin and with the devil. Yet, at the same time, there is no turning back the clock, no promise of any return to a photographic Garden of Eden. And so, whether photographic or legal scholars, we are perhaps those confused historians of future times who look now to our own digital spirits faced with the same evidentiary quandary that Mumler's audience faced circa 1869 when they viewed his spirit photos and when they had to decide about the veracity of his purported documentation of ghosts. Are today's digital images examples of actual documents or montage illusions? Are they to be taken deadly seriously or seen as photographic amusements? Suspending our disbelief, we are hopeful that seeing is believing and that these images are really and truly the case. But brought back to the reality principle, we are genuinely suspicious that what we are witnessing are nothing but hoaxes, pranks, photo-manipulative packs of lies. From Mumler's spirit photographs to this, our digital era, we are always being asked to make a decision about the photographic image, to judge whether it reveals a spook or a proof. And isn't that the truth? Thank you.
Any questions? All right, well, I'll start. No, you stay where you are. I just guess a question that often comes up and that people sometimes ask me about spirit photography is, how convincing were these pictures to people in the 1860s? And was it only people who already believed in spirits who were convinced by these pictures, or did skeptics look at these and say, well, I guess if it's photographed, that maybe it's actually true?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the last point you made is exactly the argument that Jennifer Tucker makes in her work on Victorian photography and looking at some 19th century spirit photographers, more in the British context than in the American context. But that's exactly what her point is, to say that there's that's the flip side of what I was arguing, to say that if it's a photograph, photographs do not lie. Therefore, if I see this photograph, I'm convinced. How could it be and otherwise? So that flip is also a possible response from the spectator's point of view. But again, I mean, I think the line that someone like Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. takes in this is that these people are in a certain heightened state of bereavement. I mean, the ones who are the best buyers of Mumler's clientele, and so they're going to be predisposed to interpret any, as he calls it, foggy dumpling. I think this term he uses, foggy dumpling, of a baby. They will interpret it as the child who passed away, and now they're in this kind of post-mortem state of mourning. So I think predisposition is also related here, whereby you could be in a state of mourning, not be necessarily a fervent believer in spiritualism, and still want to buy in on the psychological level to Mumler's photographs.
What percentage of Mumler's customers do you have any idea did buy in and were happy with what they got? Do you know?
I don't know. I couldn't give you a percentage figure, but he I mean, there were people that wanted their money back. There were complaints. There were people that saw it, like the Tucker case, right? Saw this and said, "You claimed you would do this, but this is not what you gave me. This is just a sham." So I can't really give you percentages, but there were dissatisfied customers as well as satisfied customers. Did you want to follow up? Or no?
I just want to ask, what about Mary Todd Lincoln? Was Mary Todd Lincoln
a
believer?
Totally. She's totally convinced. She's like the best customer possible. But I also want to raise an interesting point, and my book shows this, that 1872 was not the first time that Mumler had an encounter with Mary Todd Lincoln. And it really makes the story so much more complicated, right? Because she actually, and I include that illustration in my book, that photograph in my book, she actually sat for Mumler in what became a carte de visite, and that was circulated around 1864 or so, when she was still the First Lady. So he says that when she came in, she was almost like cloaked, with her head, she's all in black, and she had this veil so that he couldn't recognize her, and she called herself Mrs. Lindell, like in the registry, instead of Mrs. Lincoln. So there's this whole story about the disguise that's involved. But then again, my research has uncovered that Mumler photographed her in a sitting as herself, not a spirit photograph, just a portrait, right? In at the time, around 1863, 1864. So it again creates a kind of cognitive dissonance between his account and what we know historically about his own photographic practice, because he only didn't do spirit photographs, right? He had a commercial practice as well. Yeah. I know. You're the moderator.
So, and also along in that same vein,
yeah.
So he had a photograph of Lincoln, obviously, to use. Therefore, she recognized Lincoln. But for other people, they're just random people in the photographs. Right. And so I'm wondering, did he have a series of pictures that he reused?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And also, did he ever ask people for pictures of the deceased? Just, I don't know, that he would add in.
Okay, good. That's a great question. So there are I'll give you two types of response to that one. I always want to tell two sides of the story. One is, again, what I said before, that he would use stock pictures. And a lot of them, of course, are blurry. Some of the spirits do not come up. There's some static in terms of the reception, so you can't visually see everything. So one theory is to say, well, he had these stock photographs of the kinds of ages or descriptions of what they would answer to. He'd put that person in there, and then again, being in the state of wanting to believe they would believe. Okay, that's what Wendell Holmes is saying, right? But there's another theory, and it comes from none other than our colleague Robert Hirsch, right, the photo historian and photographer who published, I talk about this in my book, who published his photo textbook, Seizing the Light. Some of you might know this book from history of photography courses, all right? And it's the first time when Mumler enters the canon that I know of in a photo history textbook. And Hirsch's view, I'm assuming he did some research on this, I don't know, but his view is that Mumler was not only a con man in the studio, he also was a thief outside of the studio, and that he somehow managed to forget himself or his informants to smuggle his way into people's possessions where they would pilfer photographs of the beloveds of the deceased, and then he would make them from them. And so this is actually, if you read Hirsch's textbook, that's I'm kind of giving you a paraphrase of his understanding of what happened. So I'm not going to give you the definitive answer, but I'm going to tell you a couple of ways of interpreting how he did the trick. Yeah. Next.
I'd like to pick up on that, or have you take it a step or two further.
Sure.
A number of the figures in the ghost figures
Some
in
of them
there
are well known.
are known.
That's right.
People,
Some of them are known
right?
quantities. That's right.
And presumably, there were photographs of them in circulation.
Yeah, Charles
already,
Sumner, for instance.
right? Charles Sumner, because of mine. Right?
Obvious.
So, I'm curious about the prosecuting attorney's strategies here. Did he at any point introduce any existing images of those people that matched images that appeared in Mumler's pictures
Great
as
question.
ghosts?
In all the court,
right?
I mean, I've read all the court transcripts.
And
Yep.
the second
Sorry.
part of the question would be, did he at any point try to replicate the process for the jury, which is not
Yes.
that complicated a process of how you make a photo montage?
Well, they didn't do a reenactment of the studio, but they did talk about the different methods. That's what I said. I mean, we can review them. I mean, you know them as well as I do. But you know, there's the number 1 and 2 are the most obvious. The previously used negative that therefore has the trace of the ghost then being planted into the plate holder, and then of course the other popular one, which is listed as number 2 in the trial, is Brewster's ghost. Right? The idea that someone would, which I think would be harder actually, that someone would, you know, somebody would just pop in behind, you know, for a second or two, but yeah, obviously that one is a little bit more. But there, of course, you know, there are a number of different methods that were introduced. But there was no reenactment at the trial of, you know, coming in and saying this is, you know, it was just basically reporting on like Rockwood testifying, Bogartis testifying in terms of how this could be done or how I did it, right? To show that the idea of mechanical illusionism should carry the day in court.
But no sort of smoking gun of,
no.
Here's the cabinet portrait of Charles Sumner.
I wish. Right, it's exactly the same. Yeah, no, that did not happen at the trial. Yeah, it's a good question.
Well, was there any discernible improvement from his early work to his later work that would be indicative of him improving his
technique? Not really. No, I mean as you see, there's a real Mumler style, and no matter what particular image you look at, I mean, it's just the way in which he, you know, was able to achieve his effects the best, and he kind of stuck with it. And what's really interesting is that right after the trial, I mean, that's the thing people don't forget, shouldn't forget. After the trial, which was 1869, I mean, he was disgraced, but he went back to Boston and he lived another day. And again, the photo that he took of Mary Todd Lincoln is 3 years after the trial, right? So he's still in business, he's still got believers, he's still practicing, and he's still cranking out these photo spirits for whoever, you know, for the taking in a new studio. So, yep. Is it Miles?
I think we
one more,
need
maybe?
to.
Miles.
All right, one more quick question and answer.
Okay, thank you.
This is about England and America.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you considered Mumler in relation to the Cottingley Fairies.
Yeah, Cottingley Fairies, sure. But the British experience is much earlier than that, right?
Yeah.
It's Frederick Hudson.
In the early
right?
20th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
yeah.
no, it's P.T. Barnum I'm really interested in.
Okay,
here.
sure.
And Barnum's influence on American culture, which you would think would raise everyone's suspicions about hoaxes to a high degree and incline the American public to be skeptical.
That's right.
Whereas in England, perhaps without that, there might be more credulity. But I'm just wondering if there are any sort of like cultural comparisons you might venture.
Yeah. If I may, I wanted to raise a point on that, though, that I think was awesome. We can talk about that later, but I want to talk about one more point about Barnum, which I think is really interesting. Because the real question is, you know, that's raised at the trial, and Michael Leja makes this point in his work on the subject, is what's really the difference between what Mumler was doing and what Barnum was doing? And shouldn't Barnum be on trial as much as Mumler's on trial? And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think the key is, and that's again why, I think this is a way to close out, that I don't want us to think about this story not only as novelties and amusements, because they're not, right? The point is, if they were just novelties and amusements, there wouldn't have been this trial. The point is that it was underlying saying that it has to do with this question of religious belief, right? And has to do with claiming the supernatural effects of these images seriously, right? And that's what separates, because Barnum is saying it's drapery, right? Whereas Mumler is, when push comes to shove, it's saying these are indexical shots of supernatural and heavenly reference. And that's more than just a novelty and amusement. So.